my guest, Azamat Junisbai, who is a professor of sociology at Pitzer College in California. And he was born and raised in Kazakhstan and has provided some very interesting, given me some very interesting lessons about especially Russian imperialism and understanding what's going on right now and why it is that Russian propaganda and the things that Putin are saying, which sounds crazy to a lot of people in Europe, are they have a logical component and a logical connection, you could say resonance. I'd like to first start with this quote from one of his Twitter threads. It says that amidst all the turmoil of Russian history, one part of Russian worldview persisted. The remarkably stable and enduring phenomenon transcending different historical periods and the regime types is the self-conception of Russia as a great power that brings good to those around it, and Russian people as bearers of superior culture and morality. Deeply internalized, the idea of its own benevolence has long permeated and shaped Russian society. And in this narrative, unlike the old European powers guilty of ruthless colonial conquest, Russia is a selfless bringer of culture, prosperity, and order. So, thank you for joining me here and for your insights so far. I heard
Thank you so much for having me.
At a conference in Washington D.C. You must be quite busy these days.
Yeah, it's been a busy few months, I suppose.
It's not always that's things that you've been studying and experiencing for most of your life suddenly becomes so topical on the world agenda.
It is very true. Yeah, it seems right now there is a lot of attention to the region that perhaps normally does not get quite so much of it.
So to start with, perhaps you could tell a little bit about yourself and how you developed your knowledge and your background that makes you such an expert on this field.
Of course, thank you so much. Yeah, so as you said, I was born and raised in what was then the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. But I was born in the capital, the city is Almaty. The capital since moved to Astana, but yeah, back when I was growing up, it was the capital city. And I was about 16 when the Soviet Union fell apart, right? So
that experience like? Just what was your impression of things like? It must seem like
it's just it was, you know, it was interesting. I think in some ways it has shaped me. The fact that, you know, in my formative years, I witnessed this regime that seemed so complete and huge and all powerful. And it was in every part of life, it just vanished, it crumbled, right? And it just disappeared. So when I was, you know, in elementary school, every child in the Soviet Union was Oktyabryonik, right? So you would wear the little red star with the baby Lenin face on it, right? So I was that. And then I think in fourth grade, you are accepted into the Young Pioneer organization with, you know, the red scarf and everything. And, you know, I was accepted into that organization as a fourth grader. I remember it was in this beautiful park across the street from our school next to the monument of Lenin. And then, you know, in high school, you're supposed to become member of the Youth Communist League, Komsomol. But by that point, everything fell apart, right? So I got to be Oktyabryonik and then Pioneer, but never the member of the Komsomol, right, of the Youth Communist League, because the system crumbled. And it was I always try to find words to describe the magnitude of change and just how dramatic the change was for my students here in the United States. And it's difficult, right? So it's just so many things, right? So economic things, right? For example, you know, the Soviet Union, of course, had the command economy, right? Where prices were fixed. You knew that this particular bottle of milk cost this much, always that, never more, never less. I, to this day, still have, you know, some forks and knives from when I was growing up, and it had prices literally stamped into the metal. right? Because planners in Moscow decided this particular fork is going to cost 37 kopecks. And that's what it was going to be. And so they could just stamp it into the metal, so there is no confusion, right? And so I actually, a few years ago, I gave a couple of these forks to my colleagues who are professors of economics here in California, and they were just blown away by this, right? Just how different.
Stable value over so long time. So.
Yeah. No, the idea that your government has the authority to literally stamp the price of a pot or a pan or a fork into the metal, and that's what it will be forever. That's what it's going to be, right? So you go from that level of economic stability, I suppose, right? And that's how everything is so controlled, to hyperinflation, right? So in the early 90s, in Kazakhstan, the inflation, reached over 1,000%. And so people literally, like in my family, and I think we were not the only ones, people just did not know what to make of it, right? So the money you made, or the money maybe that your parents saved up, hidden somewhere in some corner of the apartment, all of a sudden is paper, right? And they just, some families obviously were a little bit more savvy and, could figure out what to do with this, but my family was not. And I just remember how shocked they were that, their parents' lifetime savings became basically paper. And so it was just a disturbing time. And economically, politically, people lost jobs. Even the language changed, right? So we had some basic words like, entrepreneur was a kind of a bad word, had a negative connotation, right? A businessman had a negative connotation. And all of a sudden, these became the new heroes, right, of the brave new world. But also, as a kid growing up in Kazakhstan, right, this is Central Asia, right, and definitely sort of the outskirts of the Soviet Union, you didn't really think of, oh, we are controlled by Moscow, or this is a colonial relationship, right? So it was just, Moscow was this great big capital, and we were so lucky to be there. And, it was such a great country. And the thing, of course, is also.
And you never heard if anyone's different.
Yeah, hear anything different. And also the language itself, right? So I am ethnic Kazakh, but in my family, Russian replaced Kazakh as the main language, actually starting with my parents' generation, right? So my mother and her siblings were all born in the 1940s, but they did not retain Kazakh, right? So their parents spoke Kazakh, but they did not retain Kazakh. And I remember my mom sharing a story that her mom told her. Her mom told her, if you want to have a successful life, you have to do Russian. You have to speak Russian. That's the only way for you to survive, to do well, right? And so my family took that lesson. And so by the time, I was born in the 70s, Kazakh was just almost non-existent, right? So, and it's strange to think about it now, but so I was in Almaty, the capital. Even back then, it had, about 1 million people, residents, hundreds of schools, obviously, for all the kids. And out of these schools, only literally two schools in 1983, when I started first grade, had Kazakh as the language of instruction, right? So all the other schools were in Russian. And it's just strange to think that in the capital of Kazakhstan, that was the case, right? And the current events, the war in Ukraine, Russia's aggression against Ukraine, has caused me to do a lot of reevaluating, rethinking of my own childhood, of my own ideas about language and being Kazakh, and in my case, being a Russian speaker. So I grew up speaking Russian. And the fact that I spoke Russian and the fact that my Kazakh wasn't very good, to put it mildly, it never bothered me, right? Honestly, I internalized the idea that Kazakh language was the language of the village, was a language of sort of backward rural
Hasn't.
people. Yeah, peasant village, really a class marker, right? A marker of lower status. And I am ashamed to think about it now, but I think I felt disdain or, certain arrogance towards any Kazakhs who spoke Russian with even the slightest hint of a Kazakh accent, right? Who had anything but perfect Russian,
Wow.
because immediately that marked them as, oh, village people, and
Yeah.
it's painful to think about it now because really, unlike me, those people retained connection to their own culture and language. And I was so colonized, so broken in my own mind, I guess, that I actually look down on them for having that connection still.
I mean, in some ways, it gives me the chills, right? Because I mean, we know about the Ashar Silik, right? I mean, a lot of people don't
Mm-hmm.
know about these things. I learned about it. I knew there had been quite some destruction, as there always is when the Russians, when the Soviets came into certain areas. But I had no idea that we're talking about millions here that were
Oh, absolutely.
this genocide by hunger. Where
Absolutely.
horses and cows were rounded up, and the Kazakhs were left with nothing, and it was all sent over to Moscow. And
Yeah, yeah.
Kazakhs wanted to escape just to other areas of the Soviet Union where, they were pursued by soldiers, they were gunned down. It's absolutely horrible to think of. But you understand in some ways, based on your experience, you understand what they're trying to do in Ukraine. Because some of these propagandists, they're talking about, yeah, this generation will hate us, we'll kill them, their children will grow up learning Russian and they'll like us. I mean, it's chilling to think about that there didn't that you didn't and most Kazakhs didn't retain a kind of resentment towards the people that had killed millions of Kazakhs, made you a minority in your own countries, uh, just so they could feed themselves, or also intentionally they say that I believe he said the Kyrgyz, I mean they called the Kyrgyz rather than Kazakhs, is not strong in communism and therefore it needs to be eradicated. I mean, it's and a lot of people from the West we're asking people from Ukraine and Kazakhstan, why haven't you talked about this before so much? Why hasn't this been published? Why hasn't this become, as the Armenians who go everywhere in the world to get their genocide
Mm-hmm.
at the hand of the Turks acknowledged? You don't have that same push, but the reason is because the abuser is still in the house. You can't hear from the victims while the abuser is still in the house. One who's
It's
killing and
yeah,
molesting people.
yeah. It's very true. I think that a huge part of why Kazakhstan, for example, Kazakh government has not made Asharshiluk a more prominent um, part of the conversation, right? Of about Kazakhstan's history is because it is something that absolutely infuriates Moscow and frankly is dangerous for Kazakhstan to engage in, right? So Ukraine obviously has pushed hard, right, against Moscow, and Holodomor in Ukraine is something that is recognized at the highest levels and is something that is part of the national conversation. In Kazakhstan, it is recognized. It is part of the conversation. There is a monument a few years ago that went up, but definitely it's a much lower level of publicity and sort of noise made about it, precisely because it is something that infuriates Moscow. And as you said, it's still quite, the danger is very real, right? So that's one reason. Another, honestly, is if you think about who talks and where do these conversations happen, right? So if you look at the Kazakh language press, right, if you look at the Kazakh intellectuals who speak to other Kazakhs, among them the conversation about Asharshiluk, the hunger, the famine, right, has been going on for years. It never stopped, right? But if you think about who reaches the international audiences,
Right. So
right? Where are the sources of knowledge, or the epistemology, right, of knowledge that is generated, produced about the region? I mean, most of the time it was people who study Russia, or just Russians, right, speaking on behalf of everyone, like they always have. And I think it's only recently that there are people in Central Asia who are beginning to get a little bit more of an audience in the West, in the international community, and their voices are getting heard. So I think it's just an issue of representation as well, right? And we're trying to change this, obviously.
and as you can imagine, any mention of this in the UN or in other international assemblies, Russia would probably react very strongly towards this.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. No, it's something that is guaranteed to provoke a furious reaction from them. You know, a few years ago, I want to say 2017, perhaps 2018, you know, when Kazakhstan began to talk sort of more consistently about switching the written Kazakh language from Cyrillic to Latin alphabet,
Right.
even something so small like that, right? We're talking about Kazakh, written Kazakh language, not Russia, not the status of Russia, nothing about Russian speakers in Kazakhstan, but switching written Kazakh to Latin alphabet. In Moscow, the reaction was absolutely hysterical. They said, "Oh, they're Kazakhs are stabbing us in the back."
Mhm.
Right, and all this you know, this is a betrayal and everything. And so yeah, it's interesting. I think the events in Ukraine have made it very difficult to sort of not see that really Russia still sees itself as the colonial master that has the right to call the shots, that has the right to control countries that it once formerly sort of you know, controlled, and that is unprepared to see these independent nations that have been independent for over 30 years now as really sovereign nations that have the ability to, you know, set their own course, right? And it's just like that sort of denial or refusal to face the reality that the empire is no more, right? That it's and they're, you know, violent about it, right? So if you think about it, what they're trying to do in Ukraine, they're trying to turn time back, right?
There's a Norwegian author that went to interview Shushkevich, one of
Mm-hmm.
the mastermind at the end of the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and she asked, "When did you know that the Soviet Union was over?"
Mm-hmm.
He responded, "Well, it's not over because it's not over in the minds of a lot of people, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
propaganda structures are all aimed at bringing it back."
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's it's definitely in the minds of a lot of Russian folks. The collapse of the Soviet Union is seen as a terrible tragedy. I mean, the hatred for Gorbachev in Russia is real. You talk to a regular person, they'll say, "Oh, this is a guy who just squandered this amazing, powerful country that everyone was afraid of, and you know, he is the worst because he destroyed, you know, the Soviet Union." Which, of course, is, if you are, you know, Estonian or Georgian or Ukrainian or Kazakh, it's terrifying because that's our independence,
Right.
right? That's not a catastrophe. That's a good thing, you know, it's our independence. But that mindset is very common. One thing about the Soviet Union not being over, as it's still in people's minds, I think, yeah, Putin is capitalizing on it and he's trying to fuel it, right? He's trying to give it more energy. But I've been thinking that, you know, Russia's attack against Ukraine has actually accelerated the process of removing Soviet Union from people's minds elsewhere,
Right.
right? So in Central Asia, right? So decolonization, if you want to call it that, right? You know, all the warm and fuzzy feelings that maybe older generation had about the Soviet Union, that is rapidly disappearing because of everyone can see the horribleness that Russia is perpetrating in
The face of it.
Ukraine. Yeah, you know, one sort of image that comes to mind, you know, if you think about a hot air balloon, that's floating in the air, right? And what is supporting it in the air, is this goodwill toward Moscow. Oh, things used to be so nice, free education, free healthcare, and we were a big country. So the goodwill, residual goodwill toward the Soviet Union, I think, is what's keeping this balloon in the air. But I think the war just shot through the balloon, right? So I think the air is coming out. That goodwill is disappearing quickly, and I think I don't think it can be patched. I don't think it can be repaired at this point.
So what's different now between when they took part of Moldova for Transnistria, took part of Georgia in 2008, and took part of Ukraine in 2014? Is it just because it was like a full-scale invasion of a country rather than just trying to chip off a part of it? Or
I
have
think,
people just changed by the now? Like, have people become more aware of the Russian threat?
honestly, I think a good argument can be made that a lot of things that happened that you just listed, were just as outrageous. And I mean, for what it's worth, personally, I felt, sort of this outrage, for a long time, long before, the February 24th of 2022. But I think the wider awakening that is happening now to Russia as this kind of revanchist colonial power that is trying to stop time, it's due to the scale, like you said. I think the scale of the invasion, right? The fact that it's just an all-out war with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, tanks, and bombing of civilian infrastructure and all this stuff. I think that it's something so huge that you cannot really look away.
Do you think also the effective resistance from the Ukrainians have bolstered or kind of given more people like feel like they can dare to speak out, that it's given them courage to say like, look, there's actually a good chance that Russia loses this and that we can actually cast off the yoke of the fear of Moscow?
I think you're absolutely right. I think that the incredible sort of brave fight that Ukraine is engaging in against Russia, against a much bigger opponent, it has inspired people everywhere. I think it has inspired people. It has certainly burst the bubble of invincibility that Russia had, right? The idea that they're all powerful and that they're the second best army in the world and all that. I think that bubble has burst, and again, that's not going to somehow reformulate itself, right? That's just, it's gone, right? And certainly, I think the fact that Ukrainians are fighting and paying a terrible price, but fighting so well against the Russian invasion, against the much bigger opponent, yeah, it has given inspiration and hope to people in Russia's former colonies, for sure.
I mean, it seems like also the propagandists are livid. So many of them are just saying this will be the end of Russia. If we lose this, there will be no more Russia and so on. And it seems their conception of Russia is as someone who can dominate their neighbors. I mean, because necessarily the case. I mean, it may be the case that Tuva and others will break out, but probably not, right? I mean, like that's by itself. Just because they lose in Ukraine doesn't mean that all the Russian republics will suddenly go away, but it means they will stop controlling their neighbors, right? It's and they're scared to death of it. They say like Armenia doesn't like us, Kazakhstan doesn't like us, all these other people suddenly don't like us. They've been seduced by the West, right? Until they to Kazakhstan, where they gave 45 million or promised 45 million in kind of cultural support, I believe it was. The Russians was like, and they took it. I can't believe they actually took the Americans' money. Not really that much. 45 million for
yeah. No, it's true. I think that there is a there is a refusal to recognize that the countries that Russia once controlled now can control their own destiny. Like, it is something that most Russians seem to be unwilling to accept, right? You know, there is a term in Russian, ближнее зарубежье, near abroad, right? As opposed to the regular abroad, right? So regular зарубежье. Whereas, so a place like Norway would be considered, like a abroad, right? Not, but like Kazakhstan
So
would be ближнее зарубежье.
even though it has a border with Russia.
Yeah. So all the places that Russia controlled as part of the Soviet Union
That's
are
the
considered, the near abroad. And I think that there is a widespread sentiment in Russian society that Russia has this God-given natural right to decide things in these countries, that nothing in these countries can be done without Russia's approval and whatnot. And so I think the reason, honestly, for why they would worry about NATO, I don't think any sane Russian believes that NATO is going to march on Moscow or anything like that. But I think the reason is that being part of NATO means Russia cannot just bully these countries in the way that it expects to be able to do. And it's something that drives people crazy, right? I also wanted to emphasize something that I think is an important distinction. I hear from a lot of sort of prominent Russian opposition members, right, who talk about the war in Ukraine is Putin's war. Putin is to blame. The second Putin is gone, the war is done. Russians are not imperialist in any way. It's all Putin's fault. Putin's rule is a mafia rule, and Russians are victims, right? It's this take that perhaps if you're an aspiring politician in Russia and you hope to have popular support in the future, maybe they feel like that's the only thing they can say. But also, if you look at the situation as a Central Asian, as someone from a former Russian colony, it makes almost no sense, right? How is this Putin's war, where clearly Putin enjoys enormous approval rating jumps when he invades, right? When Russian army invades. How is it Putin's war when you look at survey results and you see that a clear majority of the Russian people supports the war in Ukraine, right? But I think as public intellectuals, as people who are trying to kind of make sense of this and trying to talk to others about this, we got to always, really challenge this notion that somehow Russian society has no collective responsibility for what is going on, that it's only Putin's fault, because I think it really lets off the hook far too many people.
And I guess that we can talk about the kind of social programming that goes into the idea of the empire, right? And that I remember after the fall of the Kharkiv province, or the restoration of the Kharkiv province to Ukraine, and absolute shambles of the Russian lines there, where city after city fell every day, and I was just following it every day for new news of new Ukraine raised over cities. And a prominent Russian newspaper had this editorial about the infallibility of Russian leadership. Said, all our culture has trained us to gather all our energies and focus to bring forth one Borscht, right? Kind of a leader, and to give that person ultimate power, to victory, or to lead us to success in different ways. But we don't have a control mechanism for when this leader doesn't, and obviously the implicit is there. What do we do if Putin destroys a terrible leader, and can't bring us victory or greatness? And I mean, it's as if taken straight from the pages of Mein Kampf, where Hitler talks about the idea of German democracy, and he says that German democracy is that the people give one leader ultimate power, and that leader accepts full responsibility for the success or failure of the people. That's German democracy, is what Hitler called it. I mean, that's that's what we're talking about here, right? The Vozhd and the followers.
Yep.
What what is this idea of the empire and the roles that Russians culturally are, according to this article, are kind of already pre-programmed or aligned to take when it comes to this? I mean, like the leadership culture, um, the view of violence, ways of leading, etc. Could you give us some insights into that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, if you think about history, right, Russia has been an empire for a long time, right? Um, it literally was the name of the country, Российская империя, Russian Empire, right?
And
And
that's different from just being a big country. That means that empire implies that we've conquered these other peoples, right?
yeah, and Russian head of state, was the royal family, right? It was called the emperor, right? So it was an empire, and then
Tsar,
and
Caesar, right?
that
Tsar,
yeah,
second.
and that's not controversial, I think, right? So, and then the Soviet Union, right? The revolution and the Soviet Union period very quickly reasserted control over all the territories that were once controlled by the Russian Empire, right? Using military means.
By taking Eastern Europe, right?
Yeah, and it has basically continued to control these places. So the um, the nature of the relationship, right, where Moscow and St. Petersburg were sort of at the center, right, and all these places were, under the rule, that really has been remarkably stable for such a long time. No one who is alive today has experienced anything different in Russia, right? And so the idea, really, in 91, if you think about it, in 91, when the Soviet Union fell apart, why it was seen as such a terrible tragedy, or to use Putin's words, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, right, is because for the first time, parts of this empire broke away, right? So Soviet Union consisted of 15 republics, and all of a sudden 14 were gone, right? And Russia is still an enormous country, obviously, still with still
I can say it's still the
huge amounts.
largest country in the world, and
Yeah. I mean, it still
underdeveloped,
has,
massively underdeveloped, and a lot of cities don't even have roads, proper roads. Like
yeah, I mean, the people don't have, like a large percentage of people in Russia don't have plumbing inside their houses and whatnot, right? So it's still a huge country. It actually still has enormous territories that were occupied, right, through violent wars. Think Yakutia, Buryatia, Caucasus. But again, at this point, when 1991 happened, when the Soviet Union fell apart, it was experienced as a terrible loss because the people, I think, internalized this idea of, Soviet Union as this great country. And in part, the greatness is because it controlled all these very diverse, very different places. And
so,
all of a sudden, these countries are independent. And I think it was not well taken by the Russian public.
but you kind of wonder, like, why does this small, business owner or worker care about how big Russia is, right? I mean, like, what does it bring them? It doesn't make them get a higher pension, doesn't get them more goods or wealth. What is it about?
I think it's something, if you think about socialization, people growing up, what do people learn in school from when they start in first grade and, all the way through school? What do people learn from television, from radio, from news? It's always about the greatness. It's always about the greatness of the Russian people, the greatness of the Russian culture, the greatness of the Russian, literature, music, everything, right? The territorial greatness, how it has the most resources, and everyone is jealous of our resources, and everyone wants, our oil and
Going with
gas and
right.
diamonds and gold.
Right.
Yeah, and so this is drilled into people, right? I absolutely, of course, do not think that there is something different, genetically about Russian people or not. I mean, no, they're people like everyone else, like all of us. But I think if you drill an idea into someone for years and years and years, generations and generations, it becomes part of who they are, right? It's something that obviously needs to change. A reckoning with history, a re-examination of history of Russia's place, of Russia's colonial legacy needs to happen. But much like in Germany, it took the defeat in World War II, right, for this re-examination to happen. I think something similar only can trigger a similar re-examination in Russia, right? Without that, I don't think anything will happen. Honestly, I think in some way, in some big way, part of why these horrible events are happening now is because this reckoning never happened after the Soviet Union collapsed. It was just seen as an unfortunate series of events that Gorbachev is to blame for, but a real reckoning didn't happen. And in a way, I think Germany's example is inspiring as a country that has struggled with this, and it took maybe 20 years, but it really has done a lot of rethinking and reassessing its own history and legacy and trying to take lessons from that. Something similar needs to happen in Russia. It has not happened yet. I think it will require military defeat in Ukraine for it to have a chance of happening.
I was gonna say like because Russia came out of the war with be like we're the big heroes, right? Even though Stalin killed more people than Hitler did. I mean, just except for like indirect executions rather than in combat. Obviously, Hitler caused or they caused the World War II together because they were splitting Europe between themselves. That was the beginning, right? But and then Khrushchev comes and does this kind of de-Stalinization, but the gulags stay open, and uh, it's like they never come to part with the point that, oh, are we the bad guys? Were we the bad guys? That it's actually bad to and not okay to mass deport populations to uh, cause all these and intentional hungers, genocides by hunger, to mass execute thousands and millions of people in order to try to drive through this kind of policy or subjugation. And that these things are absolutely terrible, and Russians would never accept it if it happened to them. But somehow they don't have the same kind of, do they just lack the empathy, like being able to see Kazakhs and other people as themselves and say like, look.
I think there is an amount of there is a level of dehumanization. In case of Central Asia, it's also just straight up racism, right? So this idea that we are superior,
We're the
and
white
we are the white people who brought culture and modernity and civilization and science to these savages, right? So there is clearly,
as you said, essentially we taught you to piss standing up kind of thing, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I've heard that. Like, I recently was reading somewhere, like a Russian person was commenting saying, "Oh, you Kazakhs better be careful, what you wish for. If all Russians leave Kazakhstan, in a few years from now, you will just be riding the horses across the barren steppe. There will be nothing left, right? And that you owe us everything you have, right? So this idea, in case of Central Asia, there's a heavy dose of racism involved as well, and certainly that the lives and what happens to the non-Russian people, they matter less, right, than the otherwise. But again, I think that society, and maybe that's a sociologist in me, but I think that the socialization society it exerts a great sort of influence, right, on people. What people think, what they consider normal, what they consider valuable. it matters a lot. And it's just that in Russian society, this idea of Russian people as the civilizing sort of people, the ones who are the most important, the most enlightened, has been around for a long time. And also the idea that the others should be grateful for Russian control, for Russian authority.
I mean, but that doesn't extend to all of Russians either. I mean, like, right? Because I mean, some of the people that are treated worst in this war are Russian conscripts, even, Russians, white Russians. The fact that you have like blocking troops that shoot anyone that runs from battle. The fact that, and that's not just prisoners. The fact that the leaders in the army, they shoot at, they beat their subordinates. I mean, it's a level of acceptance of violence and leading by violence that soldiers in any Western army would just not accept, would not stand for.
True. That's a very good point. Yeah, no, I think it's fair to say that the value of human life has not been great for a very long time in Russia. I mean, the value of an individual, right? Individual rights, individual sort of autonomy has just not been very central, right? And so, yeah, if you think about the military sort of strategy that is being used right now, right, around Bakhmut in Ukraine, they're talking about the meat grinder. They're sending waves after waves of sort of Russian soldiers, either the convicts or the regular army to almost certain death, right? And it's a strategy that would not be possible, I think, with any Western military, just because soldiers wouldn't go for it.
No, not since World War One at least, right? Like World War One,
Yeah,
also other meat grinder. Yeah, that was a meat grinder war. But after that, it was like people, no, we're not gonna we're not gonna stand for like these useless meat grinder battles anymore.
yeah. No, there is definitely something very archaic about
It's almost
this.
that's the price that they're willing to pay in order to be a great nation, kind of thing. Like, yeah, that's the price to pay. We what was it? One of the propagandists said, it's been nice to have peace these 30 years, but you have to think that there's been something kind of artificial about this. I mean, we're an empire. We need to be at war. That's our natural state. We need
Yeah,
to
no,
guard against the barbarians on our frontiers.
that's unbelievable. Yeah, no, it makes me think of a conversation I had with someone a few years ago in the US. Is an ethnic Russian person. Is the nice, kind, very gentle person. Writes poetry, and this was around the time when Russia illegally annexed Crimea. And I was just venting about this and saying, "Hey, this is how awful is this, and why is the international community not doing more?" And he shocked me by basically saying that he supported Russia's actions, and I was like, "What are you talking about? Like, how could a decent person support this?" And then I said, "Okay, well, let's try to find some common ground. Perhaps we both can agree that the borders as they existed in 1991 should not be violated, and then we can talk about other things. But if we agree on that, then that could be the starting point for our conversation." And he said, "No, I cannot agree with that." And I was like, "Why not?" And he said, "Well, if you look historically, the borders between nations have been drawn with blood and have reflected the balance of power." And he said that's how it's always been done. And the borders that emerged when the Soviet Union fell apart in 1991 have not been drawn with blood and do not reflect the balance of power between the countries. And so this is the process that is happening now. And this is coming from the gentlest, nicest guy who writes poems, right? And so it's just, yeah, it blew me away.
I mean, it's saying that, again, I can't believe it, but people are saying, like, the Russians are saying, Russia stops where it is stopped, right? Russia has no borders. It only has front lines that can move. I mean, that's such a pre-World War II. I mean, like it's the entire post World War II order has been based on exactly on the stability. It's like they see that as something artificial, as something fake, that's not even desirable.
Yeah, no, it seems like the Soviet period has maybe just made some people confused about the fact that, yeah, the way Russia positions itself, the way it sees the world is very sort of 19th century, very kind of archaic.
I mean, it's
Uh,
because land doesn't matter that much anymore. Like there is a reason
that's
Russia has so many resources, but it's still a poorer country than Italy. Like, and Italy has nowhere near the land mass that Russia has, but they have a better economy. They have more innovation. They have more better education. All the things that better develop cities. All those things. To think that land mass, I mean, equals greatness. That's such a feudalistic mindset.
yeah. No, it seems like definitely it's a society that is very much stuck in time, right? Somehow it's stuck in the past. And mm, I mean, to be fair, it's the sentiment that is actively promoted by the Kremlin,
Mm.
right? They're actively pushing that because, if I'm a Russian leader and I cannot really provide good healthcare, good roads, good jobs, housing, education to my citizens because my regime is so corrupt, and all my lovers need yachts and super jets and everything like that, then how do I maintain my popularity? How do I maintain my approval ratings? Well, this talk about we are the greatest, we are the bearers of traditional values, we are the envy of the world, everyone wants our resources, we have this glorious history, it becomes the replacement, right? Because I could be trying to grow my popularity by providing goods and services to my people, but that requires no corruption or less corruption, and I cannot do that. So instead, I'll feed them these narratives. I mean, in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, people talk about, it's a contest between the television and the refrigerator, right? So and it's like the refrigerator is empty, but the TV is winning for now, I guess, at least in the minds of the Russian people, right? And so the question is how long and how bad should the empty refrigerator situation continue for it to matter more than the TV? But in the context between the TV and the refrigerator, TV seems to be winning in Russian society for now.
I mean, in some ways, it feels like I didn't realize before, obviously, as one who was, our country was occupied by Germany under World War II, during World War II.
Mm-hmm.
But then we have had freedom since 1945
Mm-hmm.
and a stable democracy. And I didn't realize at that time, as growing up, that wow, we left half of Europe behind at that time, right? Like, because for my father-in-law from Romania,
Mm-hmm.
yes, the Nazis went, but they were replaced by the KGB and the secret
Mm-hmm.
police and the internment camps. And his grandfather was put in one of those labor camps, and
Mm-hmm.
for no other reason than he was educated and had made some money, right? And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
experienced again a totalitarian system. And then the wall fell, but it only fell as far as Poland, roughly, right? And the Baltics. Belarus, Ukraine, um, Poland, not Poland, Georgia, uh,
Mm-hmm.
Armenia, the Kazakhstan. They were still within the grasp of the Kremlin. They could not act independently. They were being controlled. They were puppet regimes, um, to a certain extent, or tolerated, but they were always living on borrowed time. At any moment, the Russian tanks could roll in over the border and put in a new puppet dictator. And so a lot of them, and I know a lot of people in Georgia, especially, they lived very, very clearly with this. That it's like a constant headache, the fear of Moscow,
Hmm.
fear of Russia, and it's always there, and you can never breathe free. And just thinking about the potential. Obviously, this is a very dangerous time, but the potential, if Russia were to experience a severe defeat of their army, and they're already, I think,
Hmm.
diminished as a superpower. They've
Hmm.
they're back to the tanks from 1950s now. That's what they're digging up. Um, even in that case, it would take years for them to reassert themselves. But just that, how many nations and people could suddenly breathe free and talk the truth about all the things that they've suffered under
Oh,
colonial.
absolutely, absolutely. I think that the fact that Ukraine is fighting Russia uh, so successfully and is really weakening Russia militarily, it is creating breathing room for all the other places that were once colonized by Russia and still have a lot to fear from Russia, right? So I think it has emboldened uh, people in other places um, to to see the future a little bit more on their own. In Kazakhstan, I've heard people say to me, um, Ukrainians are fighting for all of us,
Mhm.
right? That they're, of course, they're fighting for their own homes, for their own families, but in a way, their fight is also helping us, right? They're fighting for us as well.
I
So
heard,
I think that sentiment is quite strong.
heard one Kazakh journalist say, "Slava Ukraina, Alga Kazakhstan."
Yes, yes. Slava Ukraini,
Glory to
for
Ukraine,
sure.
for onwards Kazakhstan. Right.
Yes, yes.
The just finally, I'd like to get a little bit of your sense of perhaps where Kazakhstan is going or maybe going right now. It's kind of a new thing. I mean, like Nursultan, obviously, Nazarbayev was a huge influence and was controlling things for a long time. There's a lot of corruption.
Hmm.
That's just before this war. There was quite an uprising against him, and his planned puppet, became an actual leader. That's currently controlling Kazakhstan and has sent these what's it called invincibility yurts to support the Ukrainians, right, where they can charge their phones and so on during the power outages, and has shown some mild support to Ukraine, even though they really belong in the defense alliance, the CSTO, with Russia. Right? Uh, I guess a lot depends on the Ukraine war, but where do you see Kazakhstan going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, honestly, I think, like you said, a lot depends on the outcome of the war in Ukraine. And I hope, as a Kazakh person, I hope that the international community continues to support Ukraine, continues to provide the arms and the weapons that are needed for Ukraine to defeat Russia um, on the battlefield. And, if Russia is defeated, I think it will make the prospects brighter for all the places that Russia, formerly colonized. Well, for Kazakhstan, it is a difficult situation, right? So Kazakhstan has 7,600 kilometer long border with Russia,
Right.
right? So I think it's the 3 times the length of the border Russia has with Ukraine, right? Kazakhstan has about 20% Russian population. Kazakhstan has
Russia
Baikonur, the
is
space launching
launching. Yeah.
station, right? Where Russia considers that to be a strategic asset that's it cannot afford to lose. So
Uranium
Kazakhstan,
from Kazakhstan for
yeah,
the
I mean Kazakhstan has incredible wealth of natural resources. Kazakhstan is the world's largest producer of uranium, has oil, gas. I mean, the country is blessed with an incredible wealth of natural resources. And yeah, President Tokayev now, I think, is trying to walk this very fine line, right, between Russia on one hand, the international community on the other hand, and also China, right, as well, right. So I think that his Tokayev's statements at the forum in St. Petersburg where he was sitting next to Putin and he said Kazakhstan will not recognize,
Donetsk.
the Donetsk and Luhansk sort of separatist regions, was quite important, right? It was not accidental. Obviously, Kazakhstan, lots of people in Kazakhstan would love to see, the stronger, more, unequivocal statements condemning Russia, but also realistically, as you said, the abuser is still in the house, right? And there are things you can do and there are things you cannot do. But I think Kazakhstan is doing all it can, given the constraints that it has, right? Economic, political, military constraints that it has. I think because of Ukraine's heroic fight against Russia, it's actually a hopeful time in Kazakhstan, right? We'll see what happens. Obviously, hoping for the best. Hard to predict what will happen, but I think, yeah, now in Kazakhstan is a time of opportunity, right? Time of renewal. The fact that the first president, President Nazarbayev, has finally gone, right? He's no longer in power, no longer calling the shots. Again, that offers an opportunity for renewal, for political modernization in Kazakhstan. I am optimistic, or I'm cautiously optimistic, I should say, about prospects for Kazakhstan. But yeah, it's not an easy time. You mentioned the yurts that the Kazakh entrepreneurs paid for, and Kazakh diaspora in Ukraine helped with as well. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful manifestation of post-colonial solidarity, right, between Kazakh people and Ukrainian people, right? So two people that suffered from the terrible famines under the Soviet rule, to people that share long borders with Russia, two countries, and share sort of these vulnerabilities. And this solidarity is definitely the result of the war, and it's beautiful to see. So I hope it grows.
Do you think Tokayev will allow a greater democratization going forward?
I think he already is allowing a little bit more political freedom than Kazakhstan has seen. As a Kazakh person, of course, I would love to see more reforms happening at a faster pace. But again, it's probably a different topic for a different day, but I've argued before that the level of control and level of power that Nazarbayev and his allies have accumulated in Kazakhstan over the years was so great, and their desire to return to the old status quo is so great, that Tokayev has to be extremely careful right now, right? So in a way, it puts brakes on his ability to transform Kazakhstan rapidly, because I think there are people with huge amount of resources who would love to have a second shot, right? So it's dictating a much lower pace of reform, perhaps, than some would like to see. But I think the overall direction in which Kazakhstan is going is better than it has been in the past 30 years.
In the end, I thought about a little episode that kind of shows a bit that Russian imperialism, where I think I experienced a bit of it, where I went to visit Bishkek one time as part of an academic exchange.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to take out some money from a mini bank close to a hotel that had security.
Mm-hmm.
A Russian guy in combat fatigues and military gear comes up to me and says, "Give me money."
Oh.
And I look around and I see, okay, there hotel security not too far away. So I say, "No." Takes one look, and then he starts walking down the road. You can tell he's a little bit drunk, but in combat fatigue, the way he's strutting and walking, he said, "I own this place. This is Kyrgyzstan, but really it belongs to Russia."
Yeah, that's striking. That's a striking story. Yeah. Hopefully it'll change. Hopefully it'll change. I think, one thing, maybe my final thought is that I think it's natural for us to want to see change faster, but the fact that we cannot see it in any given moment doesn't mean that it's not happening. It's just like if I'm looking at a tree outside my window, I cannot see it growing, but it is growing even if I cannot see it when I look outside my window, right? So I think it's natural to feel impatient, but I think change is happening. And I think that the decolonization in the places formerly controlled by Russia is happening, and sort of Ukraine's heroic struggle against Russia is accelerating.
All right. Well, let's hope for the best for the future.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming.
All right. All right. Thank you. Thank you, man. Really was great. I really appreciated your questions and the conversation.